Welcome to the debate. So the global consensus that we are, facing a climate crisis is firmer than it's ever been. But as the urgency really mounts, the strategies for confronting it have sort of fractured into this heated argument over where our primary focus should land.
That's exactly right. It really boils down to this fundamental split, both philosophically and logistically. I mean, when you're confronting a crisis of this scale, do you put your faith in the empowered consumer? Do you hope that millions of individual ethical choices are going to somehow aggregate into meaningful change? Or is the crisis just too vast, too deeply rooted in institutional structures, demanding, mandatory, large-scale policy shifts?
And that's our question today. Does the path to effective climate action primarily hinge on individual agency and personal stewardship, or on dismantling systemic injustices and compelling institutional policy-driven transformation? I'm going to argue that the most profound and necessary force for change is the empowerment of the individual.
And I will argue that only mandated systematic transformation, prioritizing equity and robust policy reform has the speed and the scale to meet what is, at the end of the day, a thermodynamic reality.
My core thesis is that the foundational work for climate resilience, it begins and it ends with empowering the individual and the community. Personal choices aren't just a feel-good measure. They are the essential moral compass and the demand signal that you need for any systemic change to even be possible. We all know that feelings of helplessness, of eco-anxiety, they're paralyzing. But the simple act of shifting from just passive concern to active, conscious stewardship, that's the antidote. It restores agency.
That's a compelling point on the psychology of it. I get that. But we have to immediately challenge the efficacy of that approach against the clock. I mean, while personal agency might feel comforting, we have to look at the global emissions data. The top 10% of high-income emitters are responsible for a wildly disproportionate amount of consumption. And what's more, the very concept of the carbon footprint, it was strategically amplified by fossil fuel companies decades ago. It was a brilliant, frankly, PR move to deflect blame away from the institutional culprits and onto us, the consumers.
I understand the skepticism. I really do, especially with that corporate history. But let's talk about genuine power. Individual actions, when they become collective, create immediate, massive impact. Just look at the food system. Roughly a quarter of all global emissions come directly from agriculture and land use. And research consistently shows that shifting to more plant-rich diets is one of the single biggest ways an individual can cut their environmental impact. And that choice is available to almost everyone, right now, regardless of what policy is or isn't passed.
See, I'm sorry, I just don't buy that collective consumer action can move the needle fast enough against these entrenched, massive polluters. You mentioned food emissions, but that problem is inseparable from industrial monoculture, from exploitative global supply chains that are driven by capital structures, not just individual grocery lists. And besides, focusing the narrative on the consumer, it completely ignores the historical roots of vulnerability. The reason some communities are so vulnerable to climate impacts, it's the direct result of historical injustices. We're talking about redlining, the systematic siting of polluting industries in marginalized communities. Individual lifestyle changes can't dismantle generations of environmental racism.
And I agree that historical injustice has to be addressed. Those policies must be fixed. But what happens while we wait for those fixes? The planet has already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius. We're talking about how to generate change right now. And I believe the highest leverage point is immediate capital redirection, which starts with market signaling, and that begins with a personal choice.
I'd argue the highest leverage point is political and economic, not behavioral. Why are we wasting energy chasing marginal gains on personal consumption when we could be focusing on forcing institutional investors, major banks, pension funds, to divest from fossil fuels? We've seen how successful the university divestment movements were. That was a systemic push that shifted trillions in capital. That's a truly scalable systemic lever.
Okay, I accept that large-scale capital redirection is crucial. I do. But I insist that personal agency creates the political will and the specific, actionable demand signal that enables those huge system changes. Think about home energy use. When millions of households make the financial decision to shift to LED lighting, install smart thermostats, or, invest in rooftop solar, they are signaling to the market that green industries are viable, they're scalable, they're profitable. That market pull is what reduces the risk for the big institutional investors you're talking about. This isn't just about sacrifice. These are sound financial decisions that build a legacy of stewardship.
The demand signal is important. I'll grant you that. But demand is not synonymous with justice. And that's my core contention. That financial leverage, the green demand, it has to be accompanied by mandatory inclusive governance. Because without policies that are co-created with frontline communities, even these supposedly green investments, they inevitably lead to negative outcomes. We see it all the time with the devastating specter of green gentrification.
Explain that for us. How does a positive climate action, like, say, building a new flood defense, actually become a driver of displacement?
Well, it happens when climate resilience becomes a commodity. So, for instance, a city invests heavily in blue-green infrastructure, new parks, flood-resistant coastlines, better transit. Suddenly, the value of the surrounding properties skyrockets. The neighborhood becomes safer, more desirable. And then rents rise, property taxes go up, and the original, often low-income populations are priced out. They're displaced by the very efforts that were supposed to protect them. Systemic policy has to include anti-displacement measures, rent control, community land trusts, things like that, to make sure climate action benefits those who need it most.
I'm not entirely convinced. Because that line of reasoning, it creates this false dichotomy between bottom-up ingenuity and top-down policy. The ingenuity of grassroots movements, especially those championed by women, it offers these holistic benefits that policy often misses. And it certainly doesn't displace anyone.
But grassroots initiatives are often about coping. They're about resilience, a community's ability to withstand a shock, solving for justice for historical harm. That requires redistribution. That requires mandatory structural changes. Resilience doesn't pay for the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure you need to fortify low-lying regions, and it doesn't pay to retrain thousands of workers from sunset industries. That takes massive public funds. It requires legislation.
Those funds are necessary, yes, but let's talk about capacity building. I would argue that local, self-determined actions are the most effective form of capacity building. They integrate invaluable local wisdom, like traditional ecological knowledge held by indigenous communities, that is far more sustainable than these centralized interventions. When governments just try to impose solutions without that local wisdom, we see massive policy failure. We see waste. True systemic change has to integrate that local wisdom, not sideline it.
That point is well taken. Integrating local knowledge is critical. But we still need the legal and financial mechanisms to enforce restorative justice. Take a policy like a robust carbon tax and dividend. It's a structural solution. It prices carbon, raises revenue, and then that money is returned directly to households. Now, it's politically difficult, sure, but it has the potential to help low-income households who are most exposed to these harms. How does individual behavioral change deliver that kind of targeted, retroactive justice?
It delivers the social mandate for it. The moment a majority of citizens adopt a more sustainable lifestyle, they're reducing their reliance on carbon-intensive goods, they're embracing local food, the political costs of implementing that carbon tax you're talking about drops dramatically. You're proposing a top-down solution that faces massive political friction. I'm suggesting the bottom-up social shift that, greases the wheels for it.
But we have to look at the accessibility of your method. You're advocating for reducing, reusing, repairing. That's a high-effort endeavor. It demands significant time, knowledge, resources that working families juggling multiple jobs just don't have. It's almost a luxury of time.
I see it a different way. We're talking about two kinds of accessibility: resources and action. Yes, some choices are high effort, but many profound personal actions are highly accessible and empowering. Anyone can learn water wisdom to reduce consumption or master simple techniques like vertical gardening. These acts are crucial because they reduce our reliance on brittle supply chains And critically, these actions move the individual beyond that paralyzing eco-anxiety into purposeful engagement. And that sustained engagement is what fuels the political fire.
I agree that the psychological connection is the bridge we have to cross. But when we look at the really advanced solutions we need to scale right now, ethical green bonds, direct air capture, advanced battery storage, these require policy frameworks, regulatory mandates, massive public finance. They are completely outside the realm of individual purchasing power.
And my argument is that the political will to enact those policies will only exist when citizens are already demonstrating commitment. When the individual makes the choice, the collective makes the demand. The goal is to move beyond individualism by uniting local efforts like supporting community solar with broader advocacy like contacting elected officials. That's how the two forces merge.
Exactly. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we can't let the small distract from the necessary. To sum up, while I absolutely agree that personal ethics and lifestyle shifts matter for fostering a sense of stewardship, the climate crisis is first and foremost a crisis of governance and systemic justice. It's rooted in historical exploitation. Therefore, the most powerful and time-critical choice we can make is to organize collectively and demand policies that prioritize restorative justice, equitable finance, and dismantling the structures that create this vulnerability in the first place.
And I maintain that personal transformation and community-led action are the indispensable threads. These localized choices cultivate the deep resilience, the agency, and the moral authority we need to push for massive systemic change. By living a legacy of stewardship in our homes, in our gardens, in the marketplace, we provide the blueprint and the necessary political mandate for the collective commitment that policymakers must ultimately follow.
Ultimately, we're wrestling with two sides of the same coin. The necessity of the individual thread woven into the strength of the collective tapestry.
Right. And the challenge for everyone is finding the optimal balance between these two powerful forces and recognizing that action in one sphere immediately empowers and legitimizes action in the other to ensure a truly sustainable and just future.